Hello, everybody. Welcome to our final bonus teaching. I'll be giving the teaching today, so again, this is your intro. But for our last bonus teaching today and our last week of this experience, really, I've been thinking about you guys leaving, so to speak, our time here. What would I want to leave you with? And really what has come up is bringing us back to vision, bringing us back to the point on the horizon we identified at the beginning of this experience, which was joining God in tending the garden or bringing heaven on earth as we lead ourselves, others, and our teams. So today's teaching, considering that and wanting to bring it back to that, the goal is for us to leave with the mindset that God is revealing glimpses of heaven on earth or garden or his kingdom literally everywhere, and come back to the idea that we're invited into it. And that's something we've been talking about all summer. But I think the reason I wanted to close with this particular teaching that I'm going to give is because often I think it's easy to leave a space, whether physically or virtually, that you've gotten to encounter God more inside of, or think about God in a different way inside of, and think that was great there, but that only happens with that group in that context. And so today we're going to talk about a reality that I think is available to us to address that thought. And to talk about that reality, we're going to talk about temples. So temples have been around and used, just a quick history lesson, inside of religious contexts for thousands of years. People have been building temples to give gifts, worship for gods and goddesses, in all sorts of religions and belief systems throughout history. And the ancient Greeks had temples, right? The ancient Romans, the ancient Egyptians, and so on. And generally speaking, they have been a place to open you up to the divine as humans. Give gifts to the divine, to celebrate the divine, to worship, to express gratitude to the divine. And I promise this isn't just all history, and it's gonna get relevant. Considering that within Christianity even, throughout the Bible, there is the temple that's talked about a lot. So it's talked about in Old Testament, and Jesus talks a lot about it. And so I want to dive into what is Christianity's interaction with the temple been, and what's the point of the temple, to then talk about how does this relate back to us and our vision for this summer. So Solomon, David's son, is recorded as building the first brick and mortar temple for the Jewish people. But the idea of the Jewish temple goes back even further to Moses. And it gets mentioned in Exodus, and it's inside of the context of God having released the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, which we talked about inside of Sabbath. That's why the book is called Exodus, right? And God has established a new covenant with them, with his people, with the Israelites, which is just, a fancy word for a promise or agreement, for him to be their God and the Israelites to be his people. And so it's after the 10 Commandments even, and inside of when God brings up this idea of a temple, he's talking to Moses, who's the Israelites' leader at the time, and he tells Moses, make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them, which is a big freaking deal, because this is, when God tells Moses this is after the fall. So this is while the Israelites are wandering the desert for years and years and years, and they have assumed that God has left their presence. They've just figured they've been abandoned, essentially, or God is there and he's for them and he released them from slavery, but he's not among them. That's not the general consensus about God's interaction with humans at this time with the Israelite people. And so now God is saying to Moses, for the first time since the garden, since Eden, I, your God, will dwell with you. And he tells him to build what's called the Ark of the Covenant. And so the Ark of the Covenant is this thing to hold the tablets of the Ten Commandments that Moses received as a signal of the covenant between the Israelites and God. And the Ark of the Covenant, holding the Ten Commandments, is to represent the presence of God. It is supposed to be the physical representation of the presence of God with the Israelites. So, considering that, God tells Moses to build a sanctuary to put the Ark of the Covenant inside of. So to put the thing that is the representation of the presence of God among his people, make something to put that inside of. And that's what he's referring to when he tells Moses, make me a sanctuary. And it's supposed to be this place where God can dwell among his people. So Moses builds a tabernacle, which was essentially just a tent since they were wandering still. And eventually Solomon builds the brick and mortar temple. And the point of both these spaces was to house the Ark of the Covenant, that thing that represented God's presence. And both were set up like this. And we're going to see if I can do this justice. But there was, in both cases, there was a outer court. We'll just make it really simple. And this is where, like, almost anybody could go. The Gentiles, for example, could go in the Old Testament and before Jesus, was the outer court. So, like, essentially accessible to a lot of people. Also notice, though, it's going to be the furthest away from the thing signifying God's presence. Then you had a inner court. And inside of the inner court, you had, and so the inner court is essentially like, this is where women can go who are Jewish. So it's like one step closer. Then you had the holy place. So this is like where Jewish men can go. So, sorry, I'm slacking. Inner court. Holy place. And this is where people go to make sacrifices during Passover, and it's like signifying of major holidays and things like that. And then inside of the holy place, you have the Holy of Holies. And this is where, like, the high priest only goes one time a year, because it is where the Ark of the Covenant dwells. So this is where you hear sometimes in the Bible, this is the Ark of the Covenant, hear sometimes in the Bible where it's like you couldn't get too close to it because the holiness of God represented in this thing would kill you if you did. So Holy of Holies is where it's like the inner court where the high priest would only go into once a year. And this was the structure of the temple. And so the Ark of the Covenant was the thing in the center of the temple, holding the place and the representation of God's presence. And then the temple was built to house this Ark of the Covenant representing God's presence. And so it was the house, the temple is seen as the house and the dwelling place of God. So the place where essentially heaven and earth met. That was the significance of the temple. It was where heaven, the Ark of the Covenant, and God's presence, and earth met, where God dwelled among his people on earth. And so it housed the presence of God. And inside of the temple, he gave his people, because of this significance, all these rituals to do. And that's like the whole book of Leviticus, right? Is like all the rituals that are supposed to happen inside of the temple, and all the really specific, like down to what the temple kind of wood is built of, how much of it, like the metrics of it, the things that happen inside of the temple. He gets really specific about it, God does, in the Old Testament. And it's because these rituals were a way of enacting and representing and symbolizing a new order of the world that God was initiating based on his kingdom. And so it was this new order, always based on justice and compassion and everyone's needs being met. That's where you have things like taking some of the offerings of people to the temple and feeding the poor with those offerings. It was a comment on the kind of order that God was initiating on earth based on his kingdom. And so this is the role of the temple, is to communicate, to set apart a space where God can communicate and create heaven on earth for his people, and the people can understand more of his kingdom and what it's like. And there are undertones, especially in the Old Testament, where they say and understand that the divine was not confined or defined by the temple. There are undertones of them understanding this is not only where God dwells, but it is the representation of it. And Solomon even says, when he builds the first one, that this is a symbolic space for people to see and understand what interaction with the earth and heaven, or the divine and human, looked like, so they could leave that space, leave the temple, and better understand it elsewhere. Now hold on to that thought, because we're going to go back to that, but I'm going to stop there in our history lesson of the temple for now. So I bring that up just to highlight that the temple was a big freaking deal, essentially. So we have some context about the role of the temple and what the temple meant to the Jewish people, and God's place and idea of what the temple was for. And so now let's forward to the New Testament, and I have 5 verses I'm going to read. And I want you to keep in mind the big deal we just established the temple was when I read these. So these are all from the New Testament, and these are all an account of a part of Jesus's life. So first I have Matthew 24, 1 to 2. I'm going to read them all in a row, and then we're going to dive into it. Let me share so you guys can read along with me. So Matthew 24, 1 through 2, the destruction of the temple foretold. As Jesus came out of the temple and was going away, his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Then he asked them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." Sweet. Okay. Mark 13, 1 through 2. As he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." Awesome. Okay, Luke 21, 5 through 6. If you sense a theme, spot on. When some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, "As for these things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." Matthew 12, 1 through, no, I want to read 3 through 8. He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, the temple, and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. What I want us to notice here is his saying, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And then last one, we have John 2:18 through 20. The Jews then said to him, what sign can you show us for doing this? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, this temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days? Okay, now what the heck is going on? Okay, so we have just established in Jewish culture and history, right? The temple is the dwelling place of God. It's seen as the place where heaven and earth meet. Now, considering that, we have 5 verses that I just read where Jesus is essentially talking about destroying or diminishing the temple. So what's up with that? Like, what's going on? So the first 3, the Matthew 24, 1 through 2, Mark 13, 1 through 2, and Luke 21, 5 through 6, are all accounts of the same story from a different gospel. And the background here to understand what's going on is the disciples and Jesus, when those moments happen, are in the temple in Jerusalem. So this is the holy place, the temple, in the holy city for them, for their culture, and their culture. So essentially, this is the center of the center that they're at when this moment happens. And they are all Jesus' disciples, and even Jesus himself, number 1, from small fishing towns on the Galilee, right? So they are not from a city. It's like probably is the biggest city that they'll ever go to. And so it's like small town, country kids in a huge city. And number 2, they have been raised and taught to think that God dwells in the temple, to think about God spatially. So that's the context the disciples are coming from. Jerusalem was a big city, and it's potentially the first time they had seen a big city up to this point. And they were in this massive building at that point that was being built by Herod, the temple, who was the richest man in the world at the time. And they believed this building was the holding place of God. And they say to their master teacher how amazing all this is, right? The city and the temple and the holding place of God, this massive representation of that. And he says, it's all going to be rubble. It would be like, to give context, it would be like me going to, I don't know, something beautiful and holy for the first time. Maybe like Yosemite or like the Cliffs of Moher. Me and my husband just went there for our honeymoon. Like the most beautiful thing you can ever imagine that you've been dreaming about going to for your entire life. You see as holy, like St. Patrick's Cathedral, you know, whatever, you name it, your spot that you see is like beautiful, holy, mind-blowing for the first time. And you're with your most influential mentor figure. And you tell that mentor figure as you're there looking at it, how marvelous all this is. And your mentor figure says, it will all be dust someday. Like what? Like chill out, man, right? So that's kind of like context of just exactly how kind of outrageous and what's going on in those moments. The Matthew 12 verse, Jesus is saying that something greater than the holiest of holies is coming. Than the holiest of holy places, the temple, something greater than that is coming. And in John 2, he says, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days, which is kind of laughable when he says it. I think now we hear that verse often, but at the moment, it's laughable when he says it because at this point, Herod, who's building the temple, has hired 10,000 workers to work on the temple, and they were on year 46 of it still being in process and not completed. So when he says, tear this temple down or rebuild it in 3 days, in the context of what they understand the temple to be and what's going on with the temple, this is just like, are you having a a psychotic episode? What's happening? So these claims that Jesus makes in these 5 verses are ultimately the biggest part of the testimonies that get him crucified. When you look at the crucifixion testimonies that people give or charges against Jesus to get him crucified, these claims about the temple are some of the biggest claims against him in that process. And I think Jesus knows this, obviously, that these claims are going to get him into some trouble. But I think there's something big going on here that he apparently cares to communicate. And so I think that the big whole thing that Jesus knew about the temple is that it sets particular space apart. A temple sets particular space apart. I think Jesus got this. A temple was where you went and you saw it as holy, right? That particular space or that particular part was holy, sacred space where the divine dwells. That's where you go to meet God. And I think Jesus understood that if you set a space apart, then the other space that isn't that space isn't holy. If you deem one space holy, it means another space that's not that space is not holy. It divides, to set apart a space, divides space up as holy and unholy, sacred and not, clean and unclean. And this is necessary. There's innately, this isn't a bad thing because you need to name something sacred in order to conceive of that which is sacred. And the power of the temple and setting something aside as holy and sacred is that it helps you see what is sacred and holy so that you can leave that space and have seen that holy sacred thing and identify it elsewhere. And there is a crucial role and necessity with us as humans that I think God understood, who are flesh, right, and physical beings, where we need form to be able to conceive of spirit. We need a thing, a representation, a physical representation to conceive of the greater principle. It's why we have weddings or funerals or communion. Wedding, a wedding is not a marriage itself, but we need it to help us think about marriage and let it change us. We need it to transition one thing. Something was at one time one way, and now this ceremony, this physical ceremony, is not the marriage itself, but it's the thing we're doing to tell ourselves and all our friends that now it's going to be another way. There's going to be something changing here. So these are good things. To have ceremony, to have form, to have spaces that are set apart as holy, are good things that I think God built to help us understand, as physical beings, we need the form to conceive of the spirit. But what Jesus is getting at, I think, and what he understood, is that if you stay there too long, you'll end up having a divided view of the world. If you stay there too long, you'll end up having a divided view of the world. You'll see some places as sacred, and some as not. And I think Jesus saw this. So when Jesus says, that's all coming down, at first it's dude, who do you think you are? But what he's really saying is that the understanding that the divine is more in some places than others has to come down. The understanding that the divine is in some places more than others has to come down. And there are 2 places in the New Testament where Jesus is getting at this idea, and it goes into it further, that this idea has to come down. The first is in John 4:19 through 24, which I'll read for us. So John 4:19 through 24. The woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." So this is the moment where it's the woman at the well story. And I want to hone in on 19 through 24, because this moment, the woman is essentially asking, where is the center? She's a Samaritan, right? So we say as Samaritans, Samaritan and Jews do not associate with one another at this point, which is why this moment is such a big deal. But we say this is holy and where God dwells as Samaritans. And you say that this place over here is holy and where God dwells as Jews. So which is it? Which space is sacred? Let me know. And Jesus says, there is a new era coming where we will know, and is even here now, where we will no longer think about the divine based on space. He says, I've come to present a whole new way of thinking of the divine in terms of spirit and truth. God is spirit, and so we will have to worship him through spirit and truth. No longer will space define holiness and the divine. Okay, so that's the first place. And now, second spot where Jesus dives into this a little bit more, Matthew 25, 34 through 40. And I will read again. So then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Jesus giving a parable here, right? And he says in this parable, whenever you saw the least of these. And what he's saying here is whenever you saw and met a need of any people you did not look, wasn't me, but you were invited into a new order there. An order in which I've come to help you understand that the divine is present in every encounter. So whenever you encountered someone who was in need and you helped them and you were generous and you were kind and you treated them as neighbor or brother and sister, you were encountering the divine. No matter the space, no matter the person, no matter the time or the religion or the race or the background or what words were said, you encountered the divine because the divine is present in every encounter. That's what I'm here to say to you. And so that's what I think Jesus is after here in both these moments, to say, I'm here to tell you, you no longer will see God in some places and not in others. You don't have to see it that way. But rather, I'm here to wake every person up to see that every experience is an encounter with the divine. Every experience is an encounter with the divine. I want you to see the depth and the holiness and the sacred nature of all of life. So when you do whatever you do, you can do it with an awareness that the divine was present. You can do it with an awareness that the divine was present. It's what Jesus is offering, I think, and what he's literally putting his life on the line for in this moment. One of the things, besides salvation, big deal. But it was a rethinking of the temple and the center. His life was to communicate, I've come to show you that the whole thing is a temple. I've come to show you that the whole thing is a temple. Jesus comes to teach us to encounter the holy, sacred, and divine in all of life. And the beauty of temples, and that back then there was a temple. Now I think we can talk about temples as not just a space. It could be a ritual or a spiritual practice or a discipline. They help you, these are good things that help you awaken your senses to the divine. It's space where you go to be reminded of the presence of the divine, to open our eyes to the divine presence in the rest of life. It's a place where you go to see what heaven and earth looks like, so you can recognize it better outside of that space. To open our senses and heighten our awareness of the divine in all of life. But if it stays there, if that heightened awareness stays with that ritual or that practice or that discipline or that space, if heaven on earth stays in our minds only in that space, then it speaks against what Jesus comes to do, which is open our eyes to the divine presence in all of life. So Jesus comes to rescue us from thinking that there is no sacred in the ordinary and show us that the whole thing is a temple. And one of the biggest moments at the very beginning, right, I told you guys about the story and heaven on earth with Chani, right? And there's one other moment in my life that just like, if Chani didn't drive it home, this moment did, where it was truly a moment that I got to witness of every encounter being an encounter with the divine, where this like thought that the whole thing is a temple, this reality was, I think, confirmed for me. And it was, we were at a volleyball tournament that my husband was playing in on the beach doubles, and one of our good friends and a local coach that we know was there watching, and how do I describe it? Her name's Jeanette, and she is a hoot and a half. So at our wedding, this woman, Jeanette, she like played on the AVP, she was a total stud. She wore a bicycle headlight to our wedding and let the light flash as a strobe light for the entire night as she danced at our wedding. So that's the kind of person out, not afraid of attention, loud, all the right kinds of rambunctious. That's who Jeanette is, okay? And so we're watching Tim play, my husband, and as we're watching, we start to hear a little girl crying, and look, because it's pretty loud, on the beach, look to our right, and there was a 3 or 4 year old little girl who is crying and kind of whining, holding the hand of her mom, who is in a full hijab dress. And the mom looks probably no older than me, the little girl's 3 or 4, and they are running towards us on the beach. And we see them because the little girl's making enough noise. And Jeanette says, "Oh, that little girl has to go to the bathroom. My niece does that all the time. I recognize what's going on there. And my sister has to drag her to the bathroom because she waits too long. So that little girl right now is having a meltdown because she's about to pee her pants and she really has to go to the bathroom." And so they're running and they're getting closer to us. You can see the mom is the bathroom is a beeline, but there's a wall on Huntington beaches, if you've ever been there, between there's a boardwalk and a bike path, and there's a wall between the sand and the rest of the beach. and the bathroom is on the other side of the wall and the bike or boardwalk, bike path or boardwalk. And so the mom is heading towards us, but the faster route to the bathroom is this way. But Jeanette's trying to tell her, like, hey, the bathroom's over there. You need to get there quick. The bathroom's over there. And the mom starts explaining and motioning, like, hey, I can't lift my daughter over the wall, so I'm having to go around the wall to get to the bathroom. And in that, like, 2-second interchange, Jeanette hops over the wall, has the mom come to her, goes, here, hand me your daughter, lifts the daughter up over the wall. The mom climbs over the wall with the daughter and doesn't stop there. So the mom grabs the little girl's hand on one side, Jeanette grabs the hand of the little girl on the other side, and they run to the bathroom together. Jeanette opens up the first door in the bathroom, and it's a beach bathroom, right? So it's disgusting. Goes in there first, wipes down the seat, and then like ushers them into the bathroom and closes the door. And then comes back to us and is like, yeah, man, like my sister has to go through that all the time. I feel so bad for her. The little girl waits too long, and my niece does that all the time. So I'm just like, yeah, just needed to help them get to the bathroom. And there's like volleyball going on in front of us. We're like with a group of people. Everyone just kind of goes on like this is normal. And I'm sitting here similar to Chani, like, what? Did nobody catch that? Did you see that? There's something so beautiful there. But everyone else kind of moves on. So I like, okay, cool, I move on, dumbfounded in my mind, right? Just like cannot move past it. I tell Tim about it and kind of start processing, but I wake up the next day even and still can't get it off my mind. And so I sit down and I journal. And the image that I can't, and start to talk to God about, why is this so stuck on me? And the image I can't get out of my mind is the mom holding the hand of the little girl on one side and Jeanette holding the hand of the little girl on the other side and running towards the bathroom together. And when I sat on it and was like, what is going on here? Why can't I get rid of this picture in my mind? It was this realization that Jeanette and this woman, Jeanette is a 40-something, middle-aged white woman who grew up in Newport Beach and still lives there to this day, Christian, middle class. And so Jeanette and this woman, by all external appearances, probably practice different faiths, probably have totally different worldviews, probably have totally different life experiences, totally come from totally different social backgrounds, maybe different economic backgrounds, probably maybe different political backgrounds. Like on paper, they could not be more different. And Jeanette said, I literally see my sister in that woman, so I will treat her as such. And there is nothing more ordinary or even below ordinary than helping someone get to the bathroom. It is, let me get in the trenches with you. Let me literally help you get to the bathroom. Let me wipe the seat down so you can get in there quickly and safely. And let me join you in the most ordinary moment of human life. And yet, if there's not something more sacred than that moment of someone saying, I see you as kin, so let me treat you as such, then I don't know what sacred is, right? So it was that moment where it's like in every encounter, including going to the bathroom, the divine is present. The divine is accessible. He dwells among us. God is available and present. The ordinary and the mundane, the most mundane parts of life are holy and sacred. And can be as simple as Jeanette helping a woman and her daughter to the bathroom. God can dwell there. And so I think going back to the beginning, for us in this experience, it's learning to keep our eyes open and ask the question, where is the garden being tended today, God? And you stepping into the 13th day of practice in preseason saying, God is among us here. And you walking into your umpteenth Zoom call with your team and saying, God is among us here. and stepping into a meeting with your staff or your AD and saying, God is among us here. Or stepping into a one-on-one with a player and saying, God is among us here. And having awareness that the holiness and sacred you see in some parts of life is available to us everywhere. That the whole thing is a temple. And asking, how does that change how I interact with the ordinary in my day-to-day? How does that change? How I interact, the idea that God is among us here, that it can all, like the whole thing is a temple, how does that change how I interact with my ordinary, mundane day-to-day? So I'm going to pray for us on this concept and hope that this reality together becomes more and more available to us as we move on from this space. So God, would you show us really clearly how you're dwelling among us? Would you show us in really simple, small ways that the ordinary, because of your presence, is sacred? Would you let the moments and the spaces and the temples in our lives where we can understand that, where we can feel your presence and we can comprehend and see the ways that your holiness affects our lives, that we can take those moments where we feel connected and partnered and aware of you into the spaces that we see as unholy or not sacred? Would you let those experiences help us inform the experiences that we think are too ordinary to be sacred or too ordinary for you to be present? Would you allow us to walk into any room and ask the question, what are you up to here, God? You're present, now how do I join you? Would you allow us to walk into any space and say, the divine dwells here, how does that change how I interact with this space? How does that change how I interact with this person? How does that change how I interact with this moment? Because we are aware that you're present and that the divine dwells there, would you allow us to partner with you as you are showing us more parts of heaven and your kingdom here on earth, and allow us to recognize where you're working and available and moving even in the mundane, on our teams, on our campuses, in our families, in our communities, and even when we're alone, God, would you show us how you make the ordinary sacred? So we thank you and we love you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.